Alright, what we're going to do right now is take a look at the geopolitical situation that's occurring between Iran and the United States. What may possibly occur as we go forward with respect we have to link it with the historical context from which it originates in order to get a healthy perspective and appreciation for how things are likely to shape up. Because one thing's for sure, what we are witnessing in the Middle East right now as 2012, July 14th, 2012 it is today, is a incredibly dangerous, fluid situation that is a powder keg waiting to explode. But let's look back at how it became. 2.5 years later, when Eisenhower became president, the CIA actively destabilized that regime and fostered to implement and arrange a new government, a client government of the United States, with the Shah of Iran, who was in exile at the time. The United States and Britain commingled together with the CIA to overthrow the legitimate Iranian government and install the client puppet friendly regime of the Shah of Iran as a ruling monarch in Iran in 1953, and they did so. The Shah, of course, was, like I said, a puppet client of the United States, and he managed to hang on to the reins of power from 53, 73, 74, 75, 76, 78, 79 for 26 years. And during the 26-year regime of the Shah, he radically attempted to change the Iranian Muslim traditions and westernize Iran in a very, very big way. But he was an elitist, and he was friendly to the U.S. and British interests, obviously, and he was living on the backs of the Iranian people, and it fostered a great deal of hatred against him and an upsurge of Islamic fundamentalism was taking root in the form of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And in 1963, the Shah jailed the Ayatollah Khomeini for attempting to subvert his regime. The Shah brutally cracked down on any dissent, jailed people, killed people, crushed any opposition. Eventually, the Ayatollah Khomeini was sent in exile in France, in Paris, where he, from Paris, began, after the Carter administration took power in 1976-77, and then in 78 reassured the Shah because of hostile situation that was occurring from the fostering of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile in Paris, fostering regime upheaval in Iran from a distance. U.S. President Jimmy Carter went over to Iran in 78 and told the Shah personally that the U.S., of course, would be there, absolutely back him up if anything should fall apart within Iran proper. Carter, of course, left, after which, very shortly thereafter, in 1979, from Paris, the Ayatollah Khomeini fostered an Iranian revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. They very quickly, United States security apparatus and CIA, colossal failure of the Carter administration, was caught completely unaware, so they said, of the events unfolding in 1979 in the Islamic Revolution, when the Shah and his family and regime took off and went into exile from places unknown without even warning the U.S. interests, the U.S. Embassy, students, and travelers that the Shah of Iran had left the country. We simply didn't do anything, and the Iranian revolutionary situation went out of hand and went apoplectic. They immediately took hostage all the U.S. personnel. We were unable to evacuate the U.S. State Department officials, etc. And for the next 444 days, we were holding U.S. American hostages in Iran, with the demand that the U.S. apologize for interfering in Iran's affairs, that the U.S. return the Shah back to Iran for a trial, that they block all of his stolen money that he had taken out when he left to bring it back to Iran. Of course, the U.S. election with Ronald Reagan was occurring at that time. The Carter administration was unable to effectively get the hostages out. We saw on American TV helicopters crashing in the desert with a failed attempt at rescue. Reagan then, unbeknownst to the American public, but later we discovered the October surprise was being arranged by the Republican National Committee, negotiating privately with the Ayatollah Khomeini, who in Paris flies to Tehran right after he took the hostages, and now he's implementing a new Shiite, ultra-extremist, theocratic regime in Iran to be ruled as a theocracy, as he is the supreme leader, and it's an ultra-conservative Muslim Islamic republic. So absolutely 100% in opposition to the Western powers, and so Reagan threatens to militarily intervene if he becomes president of the United States, but secretly negotiated the release of the hostages upon his swearing in on January 21st, 1980. The 444 hostages fly to freedom at the very moment that he takes office, and it was the New York Times headlines that read, U.S. President Ronald Reagan swears in as 41st President of the United States, and right underneath it says 444 U.S. hostages fly to freedom at the very same moment, so that the headlines would show Reagan coming in, strong president, and then our hostages being jetted out to safety, so that the U.S. looks very effective, and Reagan, of course, takes the credit for saving our hostage situation, and Carter is a failure. Nonetheless, that's the political landscape of the United States. Let's get back to the Middle East. This whole period after Nixon-Kissinger détente is the foreign diplomacy reality that the United States is engaging in. Then, of course, the Carter administration comes in. We have the fiasco with the Shah. Then he leaves. The Ayatollah Khomeini comes in, implements a theocratic, ultra-conservative Islamic Republic regime in its place. Reagan comes in as president, and we change the foreign policy from George Bush Sr.'s architect called the containment policy, in which case we attempted to contain Iran being a hostile partner in the Middle East to, of course, the existence of Israel first and foremost, and we also supplied foreign aid and international assistance to the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq, funding, and Iraq, of course, immediately in 1981, without warning, attacks Iran, and it begins the next 10-year conflict between Iran and Iraq from 1981 until 1988, where the United States had fostered this conflict between regional powers of Iran, backed by Russia and their theocratic Islamic fundamentalism, and Iraq, a friendly client state of the United States, in a proxy war that was designed for the purpose of maintaining the balance of power in the regime. Now, what we have as this fundamental makeup is, and not to mention the fact that after the hostage crisis from 1980, the 80s, the 90s, and then to 2000, we got 30 plus years of U.S. unilateral, secret undermining of the Iranian central bank throughout the world, secretly negotiating with other international bodies and states to not have any interaction or activity with the Iranian central bank, and if they did, that the United States would pull all of our accounts with those banks, so that we could wage economic warfare on the Iranian people, in addition to the fact that we're fostering the Iraqi regime to go to outright war with Iran. In addition to that, we are doing everything in our power, and have been for the last 35 years, to undermine Iran at every turn, at every second. And today, in 2012, as you know, we have just implemented economic sanctions against Iran unilaterally, with the help of the British and European interests that are backing the U.S. in our efforts to subvert Iran even further, because of the events that are now becoming even more fluid because of the arrangement of the geopolitical arrangement in the Middle East as it is unfolding. As you know, when the Arab Spring last year had jumped off, we have Libya, Bahrain, Tunisia, Yemen, Oman, all of which in active revolution, and they are now in Egypt, of course, are all completely done and over. And now the big ongoing drama, of course, is Syria. And the reason, let me just lay out for you how the geopolitical arrangement is as it has come to exist. When Saddam Hussein had outlived his usefulness for the American foreign diplomacy, facts, and that of course happened after 9/11, when we invaded Afghanistan and then immediately went into Iraq, which was of course for nothing more than just to eliminate Saddam once and for all, take command and control of Iraq as a nation with the U.S. military, and then occupy it for the next 11 years so that we can maintain the U.S. presence within the region of the Middle East militarily, and in addition control vast reserves of the global oil supply. By occupying the nation of Iraq, we are in fact controlling 15 to 20% of the world's global oil supply, and we are flooding the market to the extent that all of those other countries began to erupt into revolution because they're going bankrupt, because the U.S. will not turn the pumps off as they are occupying the country of Iraq, and OPEC cannot restrict the oil reserves, and the price has been dropping, and as long as the U.S. maintains a military presence in Iraq, we can simply keep the pumps operating and the cost of oil down. Now that the situation has brought to bear, all of these active revolutions are pretty much winding up and over. The one that's occurring is the Syrian conflict. You need to understand here's the regional politics outside of the U.S. and the British involvement. You have Iran. Tehran is being the major player in the balance of power in the Middle East. You have Israel, of course, a proxy client of the United States in every sense, and perennial cause for U.S. involvement in the Middle East at every turn. It is, of course, to protect the interests of Israel and Zionist expansionism in the Middle East, but it's a false flag, and it's non-legitimate, it's illegitimate, and on its face. This has nothing to do with what is occurring in the current conflict is nothing to do with the threat of Iran eliminating Israel, because that isn't what's occurring. Iran and Syria, Lebanon, are what you call Shiite Muslims, okay? As opposed to in Iraq is a non sequitur because the U.S. occupation and regime change that's occurred over the last 10 years in Iraq, it doesn't have a function of, it doesn't factor into the balance of power arrangement. On the other side, you have Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, the Yemens, and Jordan, which are called Sunni Islamic peoples, okay? In Syria, you have the Assad regime, which are Shiite, okay, friendly to Iran and Lebanon, and the people of Syria, who are Sunni, okay, which are friendly to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain and the Yemen, which is the other side of the balance of power that we are, the United States, that is attempting to destabilize and remove so that we can isolate Iran, of course, is the objective. The problem here is that as long as Syria continues to exist with the Assad regime in power, then we have to worry about the presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Syria as a viable opponent to the U.S. military interest or intervention should Israel or the United States attempt to unilaterally attack Iran outright. There is the grave difficulty with respect to the Hezbollah factor. So it is the objective of the U.S. foreign policy to eliminate the Assad regime outright, and the U.S. is covertly, through its proxy sources, funding the rebel armies and factions within Syria to overthrow the Assad regime, along with its friendly clients, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, with their money funneling that into the Syrian conflict to destabilize and overthrow the Assad regime, and the U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy taking a hard line against China and Russia for implementing and funding the Assad regime to stabilize it, because if Assad's regime is able to maintain power, that's a proxy for Hezbollah and a friendly client to Iran, and together they have a blockade of balance of power throughout the whole region to offset the other balance of power. And this is a fundamental conflict within Islam itself, because you have Sunnis and Shiites that are attempting to arrange their own power. The United States and Israel and its client-friendly states like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, through their covert actions and through funding and monetary funding to eliminate the Assad regime, if this is managed to facilitate an overthrow of the Assad regime, they would foster a conflict with Lebanon to root it out, as per. So you can look for a conflict that will be organizing through Lebanon as a function of Hezbollah to eliminate the Hezbollah reality, along with the U.S. and Saudi Arabian and Sunni Islamic insurgents, to destabilize and overthrow the Assad regime before any kind of unilateral or bilateral conflict between the United States and Iran, or Israel and Iran, were to occur. So the whole prospect of Israel taking a unilateral action against Iran is ridiculous, because they wouldn't do that without the go-ahead of the United States, and the United States is not going to allow a unilateral strike by Israel against Iran, while Syria is still a fluid situation without knowing what the Hezbollah factor is likely to be done. So you can already take to the bank that until the Syrian conflict has resolved itself in one way or the other, there is not going to be any direct unilateral or bilateral conflict with Iran and the U.S. and Israel. So we have for a moment a breathing situation, because this is the geopolitical reality of the Middle East, and there are the factors that are relevant and that are important to note must be taken into consideration without this prospect of blind speculation as to the beating of chest that Iran and the United States military speaking on from Clinton and Secretary of State Clinton and the Obama administration being like, oh yes, they're beefing up military, this or that, the other. It's all smoke and mirrors at this point. There's no way, no how the United States could even consider a military action against Iran, in spite of the fact that we have vast amounts of combat troops, the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf, we have combat troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait. It doesn't matter, because the U.S. and the European economies are continuing to erode and implode as we speak, and China and Russian economies are continuing to grow and much stronger. The China is holding 1 trillion U.S. treasuries as we speak, and this factor alone, without the Syrian issue resolved first, there cannot be action against Iran. If the Syrian conflict ends up, Assad regime has been neutralized, then the client-friendly states of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait will immediately move into Syria to prop up an interim government in Syria that will be Sunni Islamic jihadist, remove the Hezbollah element into immediately take action against Lebanon through Hezbollah in Lebanon, to neutralize Hezbollah, or bilaterally strike Iran, and that would be the moment to be worried about an outright nuclear war, because the objective here in the region by the U.S. foreign diplomacy and policy at this point, as containment policy is no longer the name of the game as a function of this Iraq war, the second Iraq war. Since that has occurred, containment policy that was arranged back in 1980 from the first Reagan administration for our foreign policy is no longer part of U.S. foreign policy. We have a very different geopolitical foreign diplomatic policy in the Middle East, and it's regime change and regime destabilization, and utterly. Yes, it is entirely it wants to objectively strike Iran and eliminate Iran entirely, and they want to use the Zionist propaganda that Iran's fundamentalist theocratic regime is in direct threat to the existence of the State of Israel as a function of the propaganda to support a strike against Iran. But that is smoke and mirrors, because the existing nuclear threat of weapons of mass destruction within Iran's nuclear program is not at all a offensive nuclear program. It is a friendly, energy-intensive nuclear program that is entirely legitimate. It absolutely has nothing whatsoever to do with an attempt by the Islamic Republic of Iran to undermine or eliminate the State of Israel, as even though the Islamic have no reason to believe for any amount of foreign covert and secret intelligence information that Iran has made any offensive gestures to Israel, or that they in any way could or would strike Israel. This is a U.S. British-led underpinning that is allied itself with Zionist propagandists to first effect regime change in Syria, remove Assad, and implement a Sunni client-friendly state in Syria, neutralize Hezbollah entirely, shift the balance of power with our friendly client states of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain against an isolated, or an exceedingly isolated, more and more Iran, over more than it already is. It will be fully isolated by that point without any prospect outside this, save China or Russia. So the US and Israel will indeed attempt to strike Iran if they can neutralize the Syrian situation. So those people who are concerned about geopolitics in the Middle East and are wondering what is coming next, what I would say is keep your eye on the fluid situation in Syria, and if it looks as though the Assad regime is going to be eliminated and overthrown, then you will very quickly look for a conflict within Lebanon through Hezbollah that will be very quickly removed by the U.S. military intervention. At that point, I would begin to worry about unilateral or bilateral strikes from the U.S. against Iran and or Israel against Iran, but not before the Syrian situation has been resolved. If the Assad regime manages to maintain its hold on power as a Shiite leading bloc, a proxy bloc against the balance of power with Iran, propped up through its client relations with China and Russia, the U.S. and Israel would have no possibility of waging an outright strike against Iran because of the exposure that the U.S. military would be allowing itself, and a new set of geopolitical circumstances, I would imagine, would begin to unfold if that were the case. But I'm predicting that the situation in Syria is going to radically deteriorate with the U.S. and British, European-led maneuverings in Geneva to have failed, because there is no possibility of a diplomatic resolution when you have covert United States intelligence services funding and Saudi Arabian and Kuwaiti funding the insurgent rebels within Syria. Massive amounts of money and aid are being thrown into Syria as the situation unfolds, and the only thing that the Assad regime is able to is just a matter of time how long they can manage to withstand. And so you can bet that that is the situation as it is now.